We're joined by the Immigration Minister, Chris Bowen. Welcome.
Thanks, Chris.
Do you now regret dismantling the Pacific Solution?
Well, Chris, the thing about the so-called Pacific Solution, of course, is that the Howard government said to asylum seekers, we'll send you to Nauru and we won't resettle you to Australia if you're found to be refugees. We'll resettle you somewhere else. And they weren't able to deliver on that. The vast majority of people who were found to be refugees were eventually settled in Australia or New Zealand. Why? Because other countries said, that's your problem, Australia, not ours. Now, unless Mr Abbott and Mr Morrison can say which countries they've negotiated with an outcome so that people who are processed on Nauru and are found to be refugees will be resettled somewhere other than Australia, then it's simply not a deterrent.
But the solution, the Pacific Solution, was intended to stop the boats, and it did. 288 people arrived in the 6 years of the Pacific Solution. Since you dismantled it in 2008, 14,000 people have come.
Well, Chris, you and I have discussed this before, and I'm on the public record as saying there's a range of factors which go into arrival numbers at any one time, and there's always push factors, there's always different things happening in the world. And I've said very clearly in all my time as Immigration Minister that proper offshore processing which doesn't deliver the product that people smugglers are trying to sell, which is a visa in Australia, offshore processing which says to people you can come to Australia by boat if you want, but you're not going to be resettled in Australia, is the deterrent we need to stop people risking their lives on boats. That's what has driven our policy. That's what's driven all my efforts, all the Prime Minister's efforts over the last 12 months to get a proper offshore processing system up, which means that people don't risk their lives on boats anymore.
We can see from the figures a 50-fold increase in that time, and we can see from your efforts to try and rebuild something like the Pacific Solution that there must be big pull factors involved, and this government has never admitted that.
Well, Australia by itself, as a developed country, a signatory to the Refugee Convention, the best country in the world, of course people try and get to Australia for a better life. Of course they do. This year we've seen up until now, we've seen a 50% reduction in the number of people coming to Australia by boat compared to last year. There's been a range of factors in that. I don't claim for the government all the credit for that. There's been a range of factors which have led to that. Improved situation in Sri Lanka, changes around the world, the announcement of the Malaysia Agreement clearly had an impact and an announcement effect. So there's always a range of factors which go into it. But I stick to the point, Chris, that proper offshore processing can and must make a difference to people's decision to risk their life to come to Australia.
But in the words of Scott Morrison, as a starting point, at no point has Labor ever acknowledged its error in abandoning policies that work. That is fair comment, isn't it?
Well, if Mr Morrison wants to have a discussion about this, what he can do is accept my invitation, the Prime Minister's invitation, for a talk about it.
And what's the agenda for that meeting?
Well, the agenda is to find common ground. It's very clear in the letters from the Prime Minister and the Acting Prime Minister, which we released today. Our letters consistently say, let's work together in the national interest to find a mutually acceptable outcome. That means sitting together, not lecturing each other on the merits of our respective policies, but trying to find common ground. It shouldn't be that hard, Chris. Labor and Liberal agree on offshore processing. We agree it's necessary to save lives. What we're doing to the Liberal Party is saying, well, let's work together to deliver it.
Don't you have to make a clear proposal first, though, and say what is and what isn't in the bargaining position?
Well, you don't invite somebody to negotiate and then try and limit the discussion about that negotiation. And this is a good faith offer from the government, made in good faith. Very clearly, we didn't seek publicity for it. We tried to do it with the Liberal Party out of the glare of day-to-day business as usual politics to say, look, the Australian people want us to sort this out. They want you and us to sort it out. Let's sort it out together.
Are you prepared to countenance temporary protection visas?
Well, we're not going to put parameters around the discussion. Our policy is clear.
You are.
No, Chris, let me make this point. Our policy is clear. We've said, and I'm on the record of saying what works and what doesn't work. We believe the Malaysia Agreement would work. We don't believe temporary protection visas work. But I'm not going to put parameters around a discussion, a good faith discussion that we want to have with the opposition.
Well, that means that then you're also prepared to negotiate on Nauru and on turning back the boats.
Well, as I say, Chris, I don't believe it would be in good faith to say to the opposition, come in and negotiate with us, but here's what's off limits. I do believe that what we've said is a good faith discussion. Now, our policy position is clear. We believe that temporary protection visas led to an increase in the number of people coming to Australia by boat because it denied family reunion, and it said to people, your only chance of coming is by boat. Turning back the boats is dangerous. The Navy says it risks lives. I'm not going to walk away from those positions. But by the same token, I'm not going to say to the opposition, come in and with these areas have parameters around them which we can't talk about. The Liberal Party's got its position, we've got our position. Let's just see if there's some common ground there, particularly around offshore processing.
Haven't you released these letters for a political cause, and that is to make Mr Abbott look utterly unreasonable if he doesn't attend?
Well, if he's unreasonable, that's not a matter for us. Now, we made it clear to the opposition we wouldn't release these letters while we were in discussions. We made it clear that we reserved our right to release them if we needed to, where we felt it was necessary in the public interest for transparency. We've done that. If I was on your show tonight, Chris, and you'd be asking me, why won't you ask Mr Abbott to a meeting, I wouldn't be able to give you an honest answer unless we'd released these letters.
Now, Indonesia criminalised people smuggling in April, and clearly that's had almost no effect.
Well, it takes time to have an effect, Chris. I must say...
Are the police enforcing the law?
That we work very closely with the Indonesian police, and we have a very good relationship with them, and they are focused on these issues. Now, you've got to remember, Chris, this is a very large archipelago. There are thousands, millions of dollars at stake for the people smugglers. They will go to great lengths to avoid detection. But we work very closely. We have an Australian Federal Police presence in Indonesia. They work closely with the Indonesian National Police, and they do score runs. They do make arrests, but they are dealing with the symptoms of the problem. I want to take away the necessity for the Australian Federal Police to work so closely with them by removing the product and breaking the model.
Briefly, Minister, are more boats on the way?
We can expect more boats, Chris. Unfortunately, when the Prime Minister and I said, if this legislation doesn't pass the Parliament, we'll see more boats, we were right. And there is no reason to believe that that's about to change. That's why the Prime Minister offered to recall Parliament if we could pass this legislation with the opposition support.
Chris Bowen, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.